Hey there, welcome back to Building or Project. And this time, let's build the story section. And so by building this section, you're going to learn how to deal with overlapping grid items, why images are special and behave different than the other grid items, and also how to decide if Flexbox is a better tool than CSS Grid in certain situations. Okay, so this is the final result that we're looking for this section. And so let's start with this right side here, where we put these two headings, then the text, and finally the button. And we then, by the end, also center this vertically here in this container element. Okay, so before I already said that this one here is an H2 element, and this is an H3 element, right? And so let's now go to our markup and code up this part of the website. So we start with the story content and leave the pictures here for the next video. Okay, so we start with the heading 3. So H3, and I'm calling it heading 3. And in here it says happy customers. Then we have an H2 called heading 2. And it says the best decision of our lives. And then we also have like this special symbol here. So let me show it to you. So this one here to opening the quote and this one to closing the quote. And so the first one is this special entity. So LD quo. And this one is RD quo. Okay. Now the paragraph, which is the story text. And so right now we're using actually the name of the block, okay, which up here we did not because these styles here, again, they are reusable. Then for this text, let's go back here to this file that we have and copy it, and we can also close it because we're not going to need it ever again. So let's paste it here, and then just to finish, we need the button with the class btn. So just as we've been doing. And this one says find your own home. Okay, so let's take a look at that. And so here we go. All right, so that's what it looks like right now. And so let's first add some padding here to this box and then start by styling the H2 and the H3, or actually the H2 and the H3. Okay. So let's open up the story file here. And we see that we already have some code here, of course, and that's because of the placement of these two grid items in our overall layout grid, right? So the content has this background color, which is actually already the one that we want in the end. And so let's just add some padding here very quickly. So 6 top and bottom, and 12 on the left and right side. Okay, let's open up the typography now. And so we're going to start styling the H2 and then the H3. So for this one, we want a font size of 4 rem, a font style of italic, and we can do that because we included the italic style here in the beginning of our HTML. So this one here, so 400i for the italic text. And then actually for this one, we also, just as for the H4, we want the light and a dark version, okay? Because we're going to reuse it somewhere else on the page with a light version. So right now here we want the dark one, so let's go add that here actually. So we want a heading 2 dark in this case, right? So that's the H2. And now, as for the H3, the font size is just 1.6 rem. The color is our primary color, so the gold color. And then we also want the text to be uppercase. Okay, let's just check it out. And now here we see like a problem, and that's because of this huge line height that we defined of 1.6. And so let's put that to 1 here so that we don't have all of this space in there. So that's the H2. And so line height 1. And yeah, that looks a lot more natural. We also need some spacing here, but let's take care of that a bit later. For now, I'm going to style the button here first. And I'm also going to do that in the typography here, actually. So down here, let me just add a button class here. So the background color is again the primary color. The text color should then be white. And since it is a button element, we need to also get rid of the border. So border none, and also of the border radius. Because by default, it has some. And we don't need that, okay? So as for the font family, it should be also the display font. So font display. The font size should be 1.5 rem. And we want it to be transformed to uppercase. So this is nothing new here, maybe just to get some practice for you. Maybe for that it's good. Okay, then also let's add some padding. 1.8 to top and bottom, and 3 left and right. And again, I played around with these values, and these are the ones that I like the most. Okay, so if you want to take a look at different values, of course you can do that. So we also defined a pointer as a cursor, because otherwise the button doesn't have like this hand cursor. Now we also want a small and subtle hover effect. So nothing crazy here in this case. And all that's going to change is just the background color to color primary in the dark version. Okay, then some transition here, of course. And again, nothing all too crazy. So let's check that one out. And yeah, well, the transition doesn't look right. Now that's because I'm missing the second here. All right. Yeah, so that looks a lot better. So now let's just quickly style this text, and it should look like this. So of course bigger and also italic. So where do we do that? Well, right here in the story. And we can do it then down here, because remember it's called story text. Okay. So font size 1.5 rem. And the font style should be italic. Okay, that's better also. Now about the spacing that I was mentioning, we really shouldn't hard code the margin bottoms here into these headings, because again, we're going to reuse them throughout the page. And so if we add some margin here that's good for these situations, then that margin might not be good for other situations in other places of our page. And so just like we did with other projects in this course, we're going to use some helper classes here, okay? So I'm actually going to add them here also in the typography file, because I don't want to just create another file just for this, okay? So right now I'm being a bit lazy here for that, but it's no problem, okay? If you have a bigger project, then of course you cannot do it like this, but I'm just going to put some margin bottom classes here, and so it's no big deal. So I'm simply going to call these MB, which stands for margin bottom, and then SM, which stands for small. Okay, so that we don't have to write out like these huge class names. So margin bottom, and let's set this one to just 2 rem. Okay, and so we're gonna use that one for the first heading. Then let's simply copy this and paste it a couple of times. So small, medium, large, and huge. So 2, 3, and I'm not sure if I'm going to use the other ones here as well, but let's just fill them out. Okay, we always have to assume that our project might grow sometime in the future, and we have to be prepared for that. And so these helper classes, they are very useful for that. And in fact, there is something happening in CSS right now where people are starting to like style their entire pages using only these small and unique classes. That's called atomic CSS. And if you want to look into that, it's also quite interesting. I'm not sure if I'm a big fan of that right now, but I can definitely see how it's useful to use these classes here in some points, okay? So sometimes it's really useful. maybe it's a bit too much to style all of the elements on your page just using these helper classes like some people are doing, but definitely they have a place in CSS development, okay? And so right now, let me go ahead and actually use them, okay? So the first one here, I wanted to have a margin bottom of small, and this one, a margin bottom of medium. And let me take a look. So this one is 4 rem here. So let's actually use this one here for the paragraph. Okay, so margin bottom and large. Or I could actually put these 4 rem margin bottom directly on this element here, right? Because it's not a reusable one. So let me come here to the story text and simply add a margin bottom of 4 rem here in this case. Okay, so instead of using a helper class here, it's not really necessary because it is not a reusable element that I want to reuse somewhere else on the page. Okay, and so yeah, that's what it looked like, and the spacing looks good like this. And so we're ready to move on to the next step, which is to actually vertically center all of this here in this parent container. Now, how are we actually going to do that? Well, we could, of course, use CSS Grid once more, and it wouldn't be all too difficult to do that. However, this is just a one-dimensional layout, in fact, right? So you have this element here, then this, and then this, all after another. But on the sides, you don't have anything else. And so it's just a one-dimensional layout, like it's going in this direction from here to here. So we could use, instead of CSS Grid, Flexbox here, right? And remember that I said that in modern web development, CSS Grid is sometimes, or actually many times, used together with Flexbox. And in this case, Flexbox is clearly a good solution to do exactly what we want to do here. Okay? And so you can also practice some Flexbox here, and so that's a great opportunity as well. So how are we going to do that? Well, first of all, we need to say that this content here, which is the parent element, should be the Flex container. Right? So display Flex. And so let's take a look at what happens here. And of course, I hope that's what you expected. Okay, so all of these Flex items are now side by side. But that's not what we want, right? We want them one below the other. And so we need to change the Flex direction to column. Okay, and so with that, remember we also changed the axis. So this is now the main axis going from the top down, and the cross axis is now going from the left to the right. Okay, so how do we now center all of these items here across the main axis? So this axis here. How do we do that? Well, we simply use justify content. Set it to center, and that's actually it. So, yeah, that's it. So you see, when we now change the size of this, you see that it always stays here nicely vertically centered. Right? There's just one small problem with that, and that is that this button here is now ranging all the way from this side to the other side. And do you remember why that is happening? It is because the align items property in Flexbox is set to stretch. Okay, so align items aligns the items along the cross axis in Flexbox. So in this direction here, it is set to stretch, but we don't want that. Instead, we want it to set to Flex start. So let's do that. Flex start. Let's check it out. And that's it. So that is the solution of this problem. So I know that maybe it's a bit confusing for you to now use Flexbox all together here with CSS grids, but that's just so that you know that this is how it works in the real world, and also that you don't forget Flexbox just because you'll know CSS Grid now. Okay? So of course we could have done it with CSS Grid as well, and so let me show that to you as well. And actually it would have been even easier than this. So let's take this part out of the code. And so instead of a Flexbox container, let's set it to grid now. And so now which property do we actually use to align all of our grid tracks in the vertical direction? That's the align content property. And we just have to set it to center. Okay, so let's take a look at that. And yeah, it works just the same. So let's actually inspect this here. So story content, And so these are the grid items here, of course, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they are now vertically centered as well because of this align content set to center. Okay, now the same thing here happens as we had before with the flexbox, which is that this here now spans all the way across this grid track. And that is once more because the grid items by default stretch all across their grid cells. Okay, so how do we stop them from doing that and instead put them here just all the way to the start, so to the left side? Well, we're looking at the row axis here, right? And to align the items in the row axis, we use justify items. Okay, remember that? So justify items start, and that should fix it. And indeed, it does. So everything works just the same as with the flexbox solution. Okay, it's just that we're now using CSS Grid here for a one-dimensional layout, and that's, I think, a bit weird. So it's a bit counterintuitive because for that we have flexbox. But of course, it's not a problem at all, and so I'm actually going to leave it as it is. And we have instead of 4 lines of CSS, we have only 3. So we actually even have to write a bit less code. Okay, so you can go whatever makes more sense to you. But it's also good to see that we can use these 2 different technologies to achieve the exact same thing. Okay. Now another thing that I just noticed when I was resizing this page here is that at some point there's not enough space here, and we have a bit too much space here on the left and on the right side. And so we can also, instead of having it hard-coded like this here, so the left and right paddings, they're hard-coded to being 12 rem. We can also set them as a percentage of the viewport. Okay, and so let's go like with 10 viewport width units, and let's see if that changes it. Oh, and that's actually a bit too much. Let's move it down to like 8, and that looks much better. And so if we resize it now, that's much nicer. Okay, so you see that now this padding really changes as the width of the container here, of the viewport changes, right? So that's a bit more natural. And yeah, so this viewport width unit is getting more and more used for building these really truly responsive layouts. And it's actually an amazing unit. It's really helpful for this kind of stuff. And I hope you can see that and you can use it more and more in your designs whenever you see fit. So this first part here of the stories is now done. Next up, we're going to then place these 2 images here. And for that, again, we're going to use CSS Grid. So right in the next video is where we're going to do that. This is the second part of building the story section. So let's continue. And again, this is how it looks like. So we have like this background image here in the back, of course. And then we have these 2 images here. This one here kind of in the center, with this couple here that supposedly just built a new house for themselves, which is this one. And so this one is on top, and it actually also overlaps a bit this part of the section and goes all the way in this here. And I think this creates kind of a modern and catchy look. Okay, so that's why I went for that. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're just going to create a huge grid, basically occupying this entire area here. And then we're going to just position these 2 images on there. We could do this in many different ways. I choose to just do it like this because, again, this is a grid course. And so that's what I'm going to do here, using CSS grids. So first, the markup, which is just very simple. So img, and the class is simply story img, and this one is number 1. And the source is image and story1, and the alternative text is just couple with new house, let's say. And then let me just copy this, story2, and yeah, let's just say that this is the new house and change this one to number 2 as well. Okay, and that is it. So let's now go ahead to our story file. So this one is the pictures part. So the container of these images is the pictures. And so let's now turn this into a grid container. So display grid. And let's also set the styles for the images. So it's called image 1, and image 2. So let's set both of them for now to width 100%. Okay, so this is kind of what we always do. We always should specify a width in percentages for images so that they say flexible, right? We're then going to change this here maybe a bit later, but for now that's good. So let's take a look at that. And so right now, of course, they occupy the entire container. So the container is this one here, and so they occupy 100% of that. But that is, of course, not the result that we want to see in the end. So again, let's create a grid here and then position these items in there. So, and what I want to do is to create a 6x6 grid, and let me show you why here in the final example. So with 6x6, basically this space here is one column, this space here is another column, and then this one here is the other 4 columns. And so with this, basically we have 4/6 of the container as the image, and the other 2/6, so 1/3, as the remaining space, right? So basically 66% of this container will be the image, and then 33% will be the remaining space. So 16.7% here on each side, on this side and on this side. Okay, we could have done it completely different way, but I wanted it to be like this. I wanted 2/3 of the width of this to be the image. Okay, and so a 6x6 container, because the same thing then can apply to the rows as well. Okay, so very simple. Grid template rows. Repeat 6 1 FR. So again, we use 1 FR to create equally sized tracks. So rows in this case and columns in this case. Okay, so let's take a look at that just so that we know where we want to actually position them. Oh, and you see that now already these images are occupying one grid cell and no longer the entire parent container. So where is that? Yeah, it's this one here. So you see it's a 6x6 grid, and each of these images is now in one of the grid cells occupying 100% of the width. Okay, so now what do we want to do with this image here? We wanted to start here at line number 2 and going all the way to line number 6. And for the rows, we want the same. So going from number 2 to number 6. Okay, so let's do that. So grid row from 2 to 6, or we could use span 4, but let's just do it like this. And then grid column, the same, 2 and 6. So let's now take a look at the result, and it looks like this. And now what you see here is kind of a weird behavior, right? And that's because this grid item here doesn't really fit the grid area, okay? And that is because it is an image. So regular grid items, like if this was just a div, it would fill up its entire grid area, right? So this entire area here that we defined, but not images. And that's because images are different in a sense that they have an intrinsic aspect ratio associated with them. So meaning that it has some dimensions and therefore also an aspect ratio. And what happens is that the image always tries to keep that aspect ratio, even if we tell it that it should fill up this entire grid area here. Okay, so it doesn't really do that. Instead, it keeps its aspect ratio. Now, if we want this to be truly here in the center, then we can simply set the align items property to center, right? That's because, remember, the align items property aligns grid items to their grid cells in the column axis. So if we do that, here on the container, of course, align items set to center, and then it is centered in its grid area, okay? So once more, these properties like align and justify, they're really useful and helpful to know them in situations like this. And you see that also it already happened up here. So this small image here is now also centered vertically inside of its grid cell. So next up is then this image here. And we want it to be like kind of here in the center of this. So starting like here from this middle point of the grid and then expanding all the way to this side. So we're going to go from column number 4, so number 4 to 7, and then from the row we go from line number 4 to line number 6. All right, so image number 2, grid row, we go from 4 to 6. And then for the column from 4 to 7, I believe. And so let's check that one out. And yeah, that's right. Okay. Now, here in this situation, this actually overlaps it a little bit, right? And how do we achieve that? Well, it's actually quite simple, and we could do it in 2 ways. We could use a transform and simply scale it up a little bit, but then it wouldn't really start here in the middle anymore, unless we then also defined the transform origin, but that's a bit too much, I believe. And so let's simply change the width of the image. So if we change this width to 115 or something a bit bigger or smaller, but I found that this one works really well. If we change it to this, well, then it's just going to increase to this side. And now we cannot really see it, but if I inspect it, then you will see that it actually moved to that side, okay? And so why can we now not see it? Well, it's just because of the z-index. So we have to assign it a bigger z-index. Any number really works here. Let's just use something big, so something like 20, and then we should be good to go. And indeed, now it is on top of this other element here on the side. All right, so looking good already. Now let's just add a couple of shadows here to these images. So box shadow 0 to rem, then 5 rem of blur, and then an RGBA of black with just 0.1. And then the same here for the image number 2, and this one with 0.2. Okay, because this one here is actually overlapping this lighter area, and so otherwise we will not see it at all. Okay, and now all we have to do is just this background area here, which I wanted to do at the beginning, but I just forgot about it. So let's do that now. So it is here in this pictures container, of course. So it's just background image, URL, and then we have to move up 1 level, right? Because once this is compiled, we are in the CSS folder, and from there we need to move up in the global project folder, and then from there we go into IMG, and then this one is called simply back.jpg. Now this is actually not all, because this is just the image like this, but we have this overlay here in order to make it fit better into the overall look and color scheme of our page. Right, so like this, it looks a bit out of place, you know, and so we need some overlay with some color in order to make it look a bit more in place. So for that, we just use the linear gradient trick, where we then use a color, and in this case, our primary color, and give it some alpha value here to make it 50% transparent. Okay, so this trick here with the linear gradient is to give it 2 equal colors. So basically the gradient goes from one color to the other color. And so that is one background image on top. And then after that, below it, basically, we have then the image. Okay, and so that should work now. And indeed, here it is. So I hope that made sense here with the positioning of the elements into this grid. Of course, I could have had used absolute positioning to position these images, but I just wanted to do it like this to use a grid once more for this purpose. And I think we created quite a nice look here. All right, and so we're really finished here with this. And next up, we're going to tackle this next homes section here. Okay, so create these beautifully designed cards. So let's move on now.